Hello again and thanks for joining me. Continuing with the fantasy armor series, this time I'll be showing you how to make Sabatons, which are worn on the feet. These are designed to be functional for LARP and other combat, but they can also serve as a great cosplay piece to cover, say, your most comfortable pair of tennis shoes, or bunny slippers. I won't judge. My preferred medium of choice is leather, so that is what I'll be demonstrating here, but since it's been asked a few times, yes, you can use foam and other materials with minor tweaks. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. I hope you'll find this tutorial useful. But be aware, this tutorial will build upon some of the previous tutorials and I'll be going over the highlights here. If you feel some techniques are not demonstrated fully, please be sure to check out the others in the series, as different methods and techniques are demonstrated all throughout. This series will continue into the future, so be sure to subscribe and don't miss out on new techniques you can use on any of the patterns or tutorials. Once again, I would like to thank Tandy Leather for sponsoring this tutorial. In case you missed it, Tandy has rolled out a completely new pricing system they are calling Everyday Honest Prices, and they have done away with complicated membership tiers. This means simpler and better prices for everyone. Tandy is a great resource for anyone working with or getting started with the leathercraft. And with their 100-year anniversary just around the corner, I highly recommend looking to see if there's a local store near you that you can visit, or you can always use my affiliate link below to shop online. In the interest of simplicity, the pattern has been designed symmetrically and will work on either foot. Feel free to follow along step by step or branch out and experiment to personalize the design. Let's get started. If you're following along with the patterns, the first thing you'll need to do is print and cut the patterns. Just carefully cut along the perimeter lines, or if you prefer the second style with a more rounded geometry, cut along the dotted line where applicable. Some pattern pieces need to be paired together before tracing, and most printers will have a margin that can make it difficult to pair the lines cleanly. One solution for this is to carefully trim the margin of one piece off first, then it'll be easier to pair the lines. You can scale the pattern up or down according to your needs. Later in the video, I'll show how these might fit a couple of examples of shoes at 100% scale, but do see the included document for extra tips on custom sizing. It's a good idea to make a paper mock-up to make sure the fit will work before committing time and materials. It's always worth the extra time to make sure the fit will work for you. Here's a quick tip if you were wondering how to make a paper mock-up with pieces like this that have articulated joints. In this instance, I'm using push pins and putting a small strip of tape on the pin to hold things together while I test it out. For my purposes here, I'm just testing out the alignment of the pattern prototype. If you need to test a pattern piece out against flesh, you can always use a low-profile tack and pin from the inside out. You can also use cheap foam, cardboard, poster board, and other materials on your mock-up, but for assessing the proper scale, I suggest just constructing it with the default printer paper. Next, you'll need to trace the patterns onto the leather. I recommend a fine point marker for the outlines, and you can use anything with a sharp point to stab in some reference mark for the holes that'll be punched out later. To make it easier to cut out the pieces, I'll separate them first into manageable chunks with a knife. Then I'll be using leather shears to cut out the pieces. If you don't have or don't want to use shears, I demonstrate other methods on some of the previous tutorials you might find helpful. For these tutorial projects, I've mostly been using a Superior Oak Veg Tan side from Tandy. It is around 9 ounces or 3.5 millimeters. You can easily go heavier or lighter from there according to your own preferences. Next, we need to transfer the design feature on the toe cap. Dampen the leather slightly. To do so, I'm just using a fine mist sprayer here. After letting it absorb for a moment, I'll lay the pattern back onto the piece and scribe the design. To make the design permanent, I'll carve the barbed design with a swivel knife and use an edge groover for the borders. Both methods are cosmetic additions in this case. The edge groover is a nice shortcut for a decorative border. If you're careful, you can freehand some of the inner curves as well. I will repeat the border process along the visible edges for the remaining pieces. With that done, next up is beveling. I'll be using a No. 1 beveler to remove the top and bottom edges from all of the pieces. This will begin to round the profile of the edges, which will make a cleaner look and prep them for burnishing. To make the process a bit easier, I like to dampen all the edges a little, but not too wet or you won't get a clean bevel. You can do this dry, but I find the moisture helps control the fibers by compressing the edge slightly during the process. With the edges still damp, this is a good time to go through and burnish your edges a little. These steps are technically optional, but I generally recommend it for most leather projects, especially armor pieces with thicker leather, and definitely on pieces that will come in contact with the body, for the sake of comfort if nothing else. Sure, most of the viewers of this video will not have a motorized burnishing wheel, and that's fine. You can use a hand burnisher like this and get a nice edge. This definitely isn't the only way to do edges, but it's probably the best bang for the buck. Next up, I'll be punching the holes into the leather. I'm just using a medium hole punch for the rivet holes and a larger for the Chicago screw holes. My apologies for the camera angle here. One of the great advantages of working with leather is how well it holds an impression. But how do you figure out what tools to use on your project? A lot of the design process of even much more advanced projects includes a lot of experimentation. Here's an example of how that process works. First, I'll select some stamping tools that I think will work for the theme I'm working on. And then I'll grab a random scrap. And in this case, since I wanted to add a tooled border, I scribed a few quick guidelines. Then I'll stamp the pattern for each tool. That way I have a good visual aid I can use to make up my mind, or a swatch I can send pics of to a client if I want to provide them some extra options or a teaser. It's also worth mentioning the 2 tools I tested out here are among the most affordable you can buy as well. You can pick up a handful of such tools and combine them to have limitless design possibilities. Now that I have a tool selected, I need to moisten the leather again to make it receptive to an impression. This is known as casing the leather, and there is actually an art to it, but for now let's just keep things simple. I suggest spraying or using a sponge, making it just wet enough so the surface starts to dry and become firm again within a few minutes so your impressions are crisp. If it's too wet, the tool marks will be deep and mushy. If it's too dry, it'll be too shallow and won't hold up. Practice on scrap to get an intuitive feel of the Goldilocks zone for this process. You don't have to choose the tool I've chosen here, you can go with anything that you prefer. This next step is optional, but you may want to add some additional shape to the toe cap. This process can be a little difficult to explain, but once you get the right consistency of moisture, it should feel a little bit like two-dimensional clay. This can be done by manipulating the leather with your hands and with some forming tools. Handles of other tools is fine. And anything dome-shaped you can stretch the leather over slightly can be good for this as well. Next, we'll move on to the coloring process. We haven't done any browns in the previous tutorial, so I figured we would go with a medium brown water stain from Tandy. I'll pour some into a container and use a piece of sponge to apply a couple of layers of the stain. I'll give it a minute or two to absorb, then I'll buff out the excess with a paper towel. I'll bounce back and forth between staining and buffing the pieces to manage the drying time accordingly. I'll be using an acrylic finish called Super Sheen to coat all sides of each piece. This will protect the leather as well as prevent stain from bleeding. Additional coats can be applied as desired. I start with a heavy coat and then squeeze out the sponge to even out the top coat and remove any bubbles that may have formed. The only pieces left to make now are the straps. You should use a thin and supple piece of leather, but something that doesn't have a lot of give. The purpose of the retainer strap is to prevent the joints from flexing too far, so you don't want it stretching out over time. In my case, I had some embossed cowhide laying around, and that works just fine for this application. For the assembly process, start with the retainer strap and rivet each piece in order. Though you may want to do a test fit before committing to setting the rivets to make sure that all the pieces will still line up after tooling and forming. Once the rivets are set, you can add the Chicago screws to all of the lames. Then you can add the heel piece, which is meant to be trimmed and expanded upon according to fit. You did do a paper mock-up first, right? Now, so that you have a visual reference for how the patterns will work at a default scale, I happen to have a pair of size 8 boots that belong to a client. They are fairly sleek as well, so they don't take up a lot of space. The default pattern scale is perhaps a smidge on the large side for this particular shoe, but the design is forgiving enough, so it works. So let's roll with him. And by contrast, I have here my own clodhopper, which is a size 13 extra wide. The pattern is rather small here for this shoe, but again, if you prefer a top-fitting shoe cover, this size could actually work by expanding the heel plate accordingly. So again, the design is fairly forgiving. Just go with your preferences according to the size. Given the flexible nature of leather plus the articulation in the design, you actually have a good bit of wiggle room in terms of functionality. All that's left now is to add the closure on the heel and strap under the foot to keep it secure. You can use snaps for all of this, or you can use buckles. I will demonstrate snaps here. If you need more instructions on setting snaps, please refer back to the helmet tutorial where I showed it in a little bit more detail. Before we wrap up, I would also like to thank our patrons on Patreon. I greatly appreciate their support in this journey into creating digital content. And if you want to see some behind-the-scenes, early access, work-in-progress content, and access to the latest patterns, I hope you'll consider checking it out. If you enjoyed this content, I would love it if you liked, shared, and subscribed to catch future content. I have many more tutorial projects planned, and I'm looking at ways I can share ongoing custom projects with you as well. As always, I'm counting on your support to grow the channel, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this video and any future requests in the comments below. Thanks again for watching. I hope to see you next time.